everyone. Very happy to have this big audience. There are many competing sessions. Welcome to this very exciting session entitled, What is the Future of Polar Research in the Current Geopolitical Landscape? My name is Doa Abdelmoutal. I'm author of a book called Antarctica, The Battle for the Seventh Continent, and I am honored to have been chosen as the moderator for today's debate. Let me start by introducing our very distinguished panel to you all. I will start to my right. Katarina Garfeld, Director General of the Swedish Polar Research Secretariat. Welcome. Yi-Dong Kim, President of the Scientific Committee on Antarctic Research, known as SCAR. He is also Chairman of the Korean National Committee on Polar Research. Let me now move to my left, Larry Hinsman, Assistant Director for Polar Sciences, White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. He is also the former president of the International Arctic Scientific Committee. Welcome. And last but not least, Alexandra Bowman, Ambassador and Head of the Prosperity and Sustainability Division of the Federal Department of Foreign Affairs, Switzerland. Welcome to you all. We also have Rasmus, our very dear colleague, here on our screen. He's joining us remotely. So let me quickly introduce him too. He is a professor of Northern Studies and Barron's Chair in Politics at the Arctic University of Norway. Welcome, Rasmus. So welcome to you all. We have an hour and 15 minutes to discuss what is an incredibly exciting and very complex topic. Let's see how far we can get in this limited amount of time. My intention will be to put 2 rounds of provocative questions to our panelists for about 45 minutes, I would say, and I would encourage panelists to be brief, and then I will open the floor to questions from you. Just a few introductory remarks on this topic. So, the future of polar research. I think it's impossible to discuss the future of science in the poles without understanding the present of science in the poles. What is science in the poles today? So, in Antarctica, we have a treaty, an Antarctic treaty system that has been built around the notions of disarmament, of peace, and of an authorization for scientific research. But what the purpose and motivation is and what the specific content is of that science are issues that we can debate at length, about which many different books have been written, including mine. We have in Antarctica a ban on mining. There is a ban on the mining of mineral resources in Antarctica. And that's a very important feature of the Antarctic Treaty System. And because the Antarctic Treaty System was conceived originally as a disarmament agreement, what we also have de facto is a ban on war and a ban on conflict in the Antarctic. But is science then a way around these things? Is it a preparation for a different kind of order in Antarctica? Those are questions we can explore in this panel. Then we come to the Arctic, which we will also be discussing in this panel. I always say whatever happens in the Arctic is a precursor to what may happen in Antarctica. It's warming much faster, and its geopolitics are also heating up. We have an Arctic Council that is a sort of loose governance forum for the Arctic. But it's a council that's not allowed to discuss security issues. It's a council that focuses on sustainability and on conducting science. But it's a council that has also now been suspended in light of the crisis in the Black Sea region and in light of souring relations with a very important player in the Arctic, Russia. Russia is not just a number in the Arctic, as my good friend Rasmus likes to put it. Russia is half the Arctic. So what does suspending the Arctic Council mean, and what do future relations in the Arctic, what will they look like in light of that development? Now, we also have had that development in a world which likes to pay tribute to wanting to solve the climate crisis. We have COP27 around the corner in my country, Egypt. But we also have a world that is in desperate search for gas in every corner of the planet. I don't think we should be under any illusions, and the Arctic is part of that discussion. The Arctic is also very important. It distinguishes itself from the Antarctic in that there is an Arctic population. There are 4 million inhabitants within the Arctic Circle, 10% of whom are indigenous people. So when we talk about science, we have to remember that we are also talking about people up in the Arctic. We are not talking about exclusively about a landmass, as we do in the Antarctic. So, with those opening remarks, let me come to my first round of questions. Yidong, I'd like to start with you, if I may. A very general question that's probably on everyone's mind. Can the world strike a balance between exploiting and exploring the poles, and how? In Antarctica, does the Scientific Committee on Antarctic Research believe that this balance is achievable?
Thank you, Doa, but it's a very provocative questions. Your first question is, well, I think first of the balance is a very tough question. It's very difficult to define how much science exploration and how much exploitation can be balanced. So nobody can have an answer anyway. But before I answer the specific question, I'd like point out a few things to consider. First, the polar regions are a very unique environment. It has, and its harsh climate, has been a barrier for human activity for a long time, but now it becomes a possible, because of technological advancement and climate change too. So I think not only the human activity, but also in nature, the environment, and polar environment is very well connected with the lower latitude. It's continue to interact each other. So the polar is not a separate region. It's a part of Earth system, and its environment is barometer of the health of our planet. The second thing I'd like to point out is the ecosystem and biodiversity in the polar region. It's very, very unique and also very vulnerable to any natural changes as well as human activities. So the conservation and management is a very big issue now in the polar region. So when we think about the exploitation of resources, then we have to think about conservation and management first beforehand. The third thing we have to think about is a difference in Antarctic and Arctic. The Antarctic, as you Doa introduced, there was a Antarctic Treaty signed 1959 already. We have CAMLR, so we have some sort of a mechanism to control and conserve, manage the resources in Antarctic. But in the Arctic, it's not enough. There is not enough a mechanism to do that, because the Arctic is mostly composed of a territory of Arctic countries, and also Arctic Sea is, except the central part, is all under national jurisdiction. So so far, it's very difficult to make any compromise, any talk. So in that sense, I think is Antarctic is a little better situation than Arctic. And also, I like to emphasize that, as I mentioned, when we agreed on exploitation of resources in the polar region, we must think about conservation and management principle first to prevent any ecosystem destruction, to ensure sustainability and sustainability and the protection of environment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. A lot of information and a lot of thoughts in this answer, and in particular, interesting to hear you say that you believe that the Antarctic is slightly better protected than the Arctic. So let's keep that thought with us. Rasmus, let me come to you. So a very controversial question, and I know you only give controversial answers, so I think this is good. We're on a good path here. Does science diplomacy really exist in the poles, Rasmus, or is science a means to a political end in both the Arctic and the Antarctic? Your views.
Yes, hello, Dora and dear colleagues. Can you hear me?
Yep. Very well.
Okay, good. Yeah, I'm very sorry I can't join you in Geneva. I'm in Reykjavik right now. I'm taking a group of students from Tromsø to Iceland, and we just came from Akureyri, and tomorrow is the big Arctic Circle Assembly conference here in Reykjavik. And this question about science diplomacy, and so I think many people, they have perhaps unduly positive view of both diplomacy and science diplomacy. Diplomacy is better than violence, but diplomacy is still about pursuing state interest. And my colleague, Björn Fagersten, who used to be at Swedish Institute of International Affairs, has just founded a consultancy, Politea. Björn Fagersten, he has said that science diplomacy is the use of science to pursue state interest, just like diplomacy is for pursuing state interest. So I think that's something we have to keep in mind, that science diplomacy, underlining the diplomacy bit, like diplomacy is ultimately about pursuing state interest. And then one more point, and that is, I think it's also important to keep in mind, I would say that polar science is strategic science. It is very much science with a strategic aim. I'm myself a Danish national, and I'm working in Norway and Iceland now. And I think sometimes in perhaps the Nordic small states, we can lose focal view of science and technology as deeply strategic activities. And that's something that's very clear in a superpower like the United States, or great powers, the other permanent members of the Security Council. And I would say that polar science is definitely strategic science. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rasmus. So I think two big messages there. One is that diplomacy isn't an innocuous term. It's a very loaded term. We live in Geneva, and I think we know all about that with all of the international organizations that are here, and we see how complicated diplomacy is. And second, the concept of strategic science, which I hope we will develop further as we proceed in this panel. Alexandra, let me come to you. First of all, congratulations on having been appointed Arctic ambassador. So, Switzerland is often described as a third pole. So, Switzerland has non-consultative party status in the Antarctic Treaty and is an observer in the Arctic Council. What, in your view, can Switzerland bring to the poles, and what can it take from the poles?
So as you all know, Switzerland is a landlocked country in the middle of Europe with a lot of mountains and and numerous glaciers. And this is our Alps. So this is what we call the third or the vertical pole. And we are an alpine country. So 60% of our territory is covered by mountains and Alps. And our medium height is 1,350 meters, and we have 48 peaks that are higher than 4,000 meters. So, as you can see, we are deeply rooted in this alpine / maybe polar issues. So the Alpine-Arctic dialogue is for us a tool to build an understanding for the larger challenges, such as climate change. And to your question, what can we bring to the table? What can Switzerland add to the discussion is Switzerland can bring scientific expertise and Swiss innovation to the poles. These are two fields of excellence of Switzerland, and our scientists prove. So Swiss researchers have developed a very strong interest over the years to explore the cryosphere on a global scale. And nowadays, and I hope that all of you researchers and the researchers in the room would agree with me, that the Swiss scientists are among the world leaders in the field of polar research. We have begun polar research in the early 20th century, and since then the Swiss science community actively participated in international collaborations on polar science programs. And as you mentioned before, what happens in the poles doesn't stay in the poles. So for us, the human changes, or the human-induced changes and the consequences it has on the ecosystem, on the global climate, are at the forefront of Swiss research. So this is one thing we can bring. Another thing that we can bring is we can contribute and benefit also from the international collaboration. We do have an interest as a small and international very active country that the Arctic remains a peacefully managed space, open for scientific research and for the benefit of everyone. And so Switzerland, as you mentioned, is an observer in the Arctic Council, and we are very deeply engaged in the Council's working groups. And we hope that in the short time, or in the short time future, we will see those working groups taking up their works again. On the political level, it's another question. And we see our role, or I see my role as well, that as a translator of becoming, for the Swiss public to become more knowledgeable about the challenges in the Arctic and to promote polar issues to the Swiss society and to make them more aware of the challenges, be it in climate change, be it the socioeconomic issues like the indigenous people, and of course the geopolitical circumstances that we're facing at the moment.
Thank you, Alexandra. I think in that answer we heard a lot of the terms that many of us would like to see associated with the future of the poles: expertise, innovation, international collaboration, awareness raising. I think, you know, it's sort of a roadmap for a peaceful, for peaceful activities in the poles, a peaceful use of the poles, and we have to see whether that materializes. And of course, it is wonderful to see Switzerland interested in the poles and nominating you as ambassador now. Because if there is one country whose flag is associated with excellence, it really is this country. And to see that Swiss flag up there, gives us all a sense of comfort that excellence is indeed going all the way to the poles. Larry, I will now come to you with a somewhat controversial question that comes from, those of us who followed recent sort of Arctic councils. In 2019, in a speech delivered at an Arctic Council ministerial meeting in Finland, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said, I quote, "The Arctic Council has had the luxury of focusing on scientific cooperation. It must now turn to strategic interests," unquote. And I think his speech really rocked the room with a lot of delegates taken aback as to what that speech signified in terms of a potential change in direction for the Arctic. So my question to you is scientific cooperation no longer a realistic objective up north?
Well, so the I guess the reason we're here today, the reason we're talking about the Arctic and the Antarctic is it is becoming more and more important to all our nations, in that the Arctic is having an overdue influence on our global climate dynamics. And not just climate dynamics, it is influencing geopolitical considerations in both directions. Obviously, the current situation is affecting the science, but the science is also feeding back to the Arctic, or feeding back to the policy. And I guess I'd take this back, to the 70s and to the 80s, and that in the 70s and 80s, I've been doing Arctic science for a long time. In the 70s and 80s, we actually saw the science was leading policy decisions, leading policy discussions. It was influencing our international relationships. And one of the first conferences I was associated with was 1973 Permafrost Conference in Yakutsk. The science was leading our relationships on policy decisions, policy discussions, personal relationships, led into political relationships. And so even today, that still occurs. And so Mr. Pompeo was not totally wrong in that the scientific discussions do lead to political realizations. And that's a good thing, I think, in that we do need to have these relationships. We do need to open these doors. Right now, the current situation, the unprovoked invasion into Ukraine is having global political ramifications, and it also is affecting our scientific collaborations. And I'm very hopeful that in the future we will see, again, the science leading to the opening doors, leading back to the positive relationships, and so the collaborations that we've had with Russian researchers in the past, again, leading to better political relationships and opening, again, policy doors. At the same time, I will say that right now the scientific collaborations with Russia are very difficult, and so our other scientific collaborations with other nations become even more and more important. And so I am grateful to Switzerland and to Italy and probably even Egypt for those partnerships.
Thank you. So science that leads to political realizations and that opens policy doors. Thank you very much for those comments. Katarina, let me now turn to you, last but certainly not least, in the first round of questions. There's much discussion about the environmental footprint of scientific research in the poles. So we've heard from Rasmus about strategic science, so science with geopolitical goals. But one thing, we don't tend to associate with science is pollution, is an environmental footprint. And that's something that's actually heavily discussed in Antarctica. Is science itself a polluter? So my question to you is scientific activity above scrutiny in the poles?
Dua, thanks a lot for this question. I love it. My short answer is no, science should be in the forefront. And I really say that from the bottom of my heart because I have a background as an environmental chemist and I've been chasing mercury. The heavy metal mercury comes from different industrial sources ending up in the Arctic and in Antarctica. So I've been chasing this metal, microplastic, in ice cores, in seawater, in the atmosphere, at the both poles. And for me, it feels very strange that me, as a scientist, try to improve policy to decrease emissions of different pollutants. And at the same time, I'm doing this research from a research platform, from example, icebreaker Odin or another icebreaker, that pollutes the pristine environment down there. So my first goal when I became the director for the Swedish Polar Research Institute, Secretariat, in Sweden, together with my colleagues, we said that the top priority will be to try to work for a climate neutral icebreaker, a heavy one that could that we can exchange from the Odin. That can reach the North Pole and Antarctica full year, because now researchers researchers are not just interested in summertime. They want full year, the shoulder seasons and so on, to try to see the changes from global warming and so on. And I'm really happy that there are so fruitful initiatives, from Professor Kim here. We discussed earlier the South Korean new ship that is already decided and will start to build, and also in US you are planning for new icebreaker cutters for the Coast Guard, as I have understood, and these are very promising efforts, because we cannot rely on old technique when it comes to ships. So, of course, those new ships, in Sweden we are planning for electromethanol ship, and that has potential to be climate neutral. I can elaborate as a chemist on the technique, how to produce that fuel, if you are interested in the audience. However, these are costly techniques, and I think that collaboration is the method to make this happen. And we shouldn't only collaborate internationally within science, but we should also collaborate with other sectors than science. And as an example, I would like to draw our attention to an initiative by Nord-Unet and Sunet, and that is a fiber cable from Japan over the North Pole to Kirkenes and down to Luleå in Sweden. There are some other plans about the geographical locations as well. But in order to put this fiber cable on the seafloor across the North Pole, we need really a strong icebreaker. This kind of joint effort between science and industry and other sector could actually bring up the money that we will need to build this ship. And also the fiber cable itself can, a few pairs of there is multiple fibers in the big fiber cable, can be devoted to science with smart sensors, because that is another way of bringing down the footprint from environmental science. We can use satellites, smart sensors, and so on. But what we see at our secretariat is that the more the satellites, the more the buoys, the more the smart sensors and everything, the more the demand for ship-based expeditions as well, because you have to deploy it, you have to put it up, and the scientists become so curious about processes. And it's very hard to study processes in the Central Arctic Ocean with satellites, because you don't have that resolution. Also, when it comes to environmental history, for example, we were supposed to make an expedition to the Arctic this summer and try to core a sediment core of 900 meters. You cannot do that with a satellite. You need a ship. And with that sediment core, researchers would be able to understand how the climate has changed for 50 million years back. And that kind of data is very valuable in order to make reliable climate models for the future. Is this 3 minutes or more?
It's a great answer.
Okay,
it doesn't matter how many minutes.
That was half of what I was thinking about to say. Okay, thank you.
That was a great answer. So you're right. A lot of the science is there to do research on how we can protect the environment. So the purpose of the science itself is environmental protection. But interesting to hear you say the purpose, at least of some science, is environmental protection. But also interesting to hear you say that we are working on improving the sustainability of the science infrastructure, such as climate neutral icebreakers. So the infrastructure of science itself. And I know from my work in the Antarctic that the ban on natural resource mining in Antarctica has led a lot of the scientific research stations to become more sustainable. So there's a lot of sustainable architecture in Antarctica that's very interesting to study. Stations that run entirely on renewables and so on, and stations that are trying to grow their own food in the Antarctic continent and so on. Excellent. So a second round of questions, and then we will come to you all. Larry, I'll come back to you. The Arctic Council was suspended in the wake of the war in the Black Sea. It also happened to be in 2022 under Russian chairmanship. Now, what are the chances, in your view, of this council being restored? And would it ever be the same as before, in particular with respect to its scientific role?
Well, would it ever be the same? Like, first, I guess I'll go back to the question: was it suspended? And so it was diminished. It was ceased. But in June, the 7 of the members of the Arctic Council, 7 of the national members, agreed to continue activities that did not actively engage Russia. So it is still active to a certain extent in some respects. What its future is hard to assess, in that the chairship should transition to Norway in May of 2023, but the chairship is not taken; the chairship is given, and so that's a difficult question, and it's hard to foresee what the future will be. And I'm sure it very much depends upon the situation in Ukraine. The Arctic Council, I will say, absolutely that the Arctic Council remains relevant and important to us. And so, and I do think, again, I do think that the Arctic Council is very important as an avenue towards peace. And so I'm very, very much hopeful that it does become fully functional in the future. And I think it's incumbent upon all of us to really encourage our nations to promote that continued engagement. So we must see it go forward.
Thank you. So some activities are indeed proceeding. Scientific collaboration is indeed still happening, but without Russia, and a bit of a wait-and-see approach based on how the war develops. Alexandra, back to you. So we spoke about the Swiss flag being a symbol of excellence, but it's also a symbol of something else, of neutrality. Now, to what extent, in your view, can Switzerland bring some of its softer skills around neutrality, a place where many peace deals have been brokered, to the Arctic through science diplomacy?
Thank you. Let me spend a minute on defining neutrality, because a lot of talk has been going on with Switzerland, the Ukrainian war, and our stance, because we are neutral. So neutrality is mostly connotated in a quite a negative way, but Switzerland never had a passive role in international relations. We were always an active member of the international community, and we would also express our views actively according to, you always have internal and external factors that sometimes you engage more and sometimes you engage less. But our humanitarian tradition and the good offices, the broker deals that you mentioned, they always are mentioned in one sentence with our neutrality. So we do see the neutrality as an addendum to them. That they're like a symbiosis with the good offices and our humanitarian tradition. So, and both are an expression of the solidarity of Switzerland. So much to the neutrality of Switzerland. And now Larry mentioned it. I mean, the Arctic 7 kind of took the decision to pause the works of the Arctic Council. And for us, for Switzerland, we have been the last country to join as an observer in the Council in 2017. And then it wasn't a great development, because then COVID came and also it interrupted the work of the Council. So we strongly hope, and I really strongly hope that I will, in my coming 4 years as the Arctic ambassador, actually defend the interest or observe behind the Swiss nameplate in an Arctic ministerial meeting. So let's see, but Switzerland is still considering the Arctic Council as the leading intergovernmental forum promoting cooperation and interaction among the 8 Arctic states and the six, I think it's 6 Arctic indigenous organizations and the Observer. And as we mentioned before, the Arctic doesn't have a pause button. And so shouldn't our work or the scientific work that has been conducted in the working groups have a pause button? So I think through the science diplomacy, through the scientific research that has been conducted in the working group, we hope that we can, we are particularly active in those working groups, I mentioned that before, and I hope that we can play a very active role as an observer then.
Thank you very much for that. So to be neutral is not to be passive. Being passive is one thing, being neutral is another. Switzerland is not passive. And thank you for bringing solidarity, the concept of solidarity into this discussion. Switzerland has a long humanitarian tradition, and solidarity could certainly come into the discussion in a helpful way in the Arctic, let's say. Katarina, very much along those lines. Sweden has applied to join NATO in light of recent political turmoil in the Black Sea. But this will have an impact, obviously, on the politics of the Arctic Ocean. What is the future, in your view, of friendly scientific relations in the North in light of these developments?
This is a very complicated question, and I will try to, this is my modest view from the scientific side. From our side, we can see that when it comes to infrastructure, Russia is taking over the central Arctic Ocean with 4 nuclear-powered icebreakers. Sweden and Europe has the Swedish icebreaker, Oden. And she's quite old, but we use her intensively and go to the North Pole, and also collaborate with other countries doing joint research expeditions with the US NSF, with Norway, Germany, so on. But I think it's very important that we really have the insight that it's important for the presence of Sweden and NATO in the Arctic to have research platforms that are capable to reach the central Arctic Ocean and the North Pole. Otherwise, we will leave this area to Russia. That is my... and why do I, as a scientist, want to go there? Well, there is very, very interesting research that needs to be done there. I already mentioned this sediment coring that we have to postpone. It was planned on international water at the Lomonosov Ridge, close to the North Pole, but it was on the Eurasian side, and Russia claims this. It is not legally claimed from our point of view, because we in Sweden, we think that international right must remain. Still, it was decided that this was too risky to bring 40 scientists for 2 months in this area that was claimed by Russia. And so this is a problem. It is really a problem. But again, I would like to mention that the North Pole fiber and infrastructure will make our possibilities stronger to be in the central Arctic Ocean, and that will also be a benefit for Sweden and NATO. And also, Sweden already collaborate a lot with countries that are already members of NATO, US and Norway, for example. So that will not make that much difference for us.
Interesting, very interesting. A development which may not make which may not have a huge impact in terms of the scientific collaboration, because Sweden is already collaborating very closely with NATO.
Yes, in the Arctic.
In the Arctic.
US almost yearly. And in the central Arctic Ocean.
Yes.
But also land-based research, Greenland and so on. But half of the Arctic geographical area is closed for us now. So, but international waters should be open if we decide to go there. And I think that the international right must remain. But at the same time, we must have research infrastructure to be able to go there in a safe way and in a planned way, not just say to the scientists, okay, you can do science on the North Pole if we reach it. I mean, you have to plan science in another way. Thank you.
Doing science in a planned way, doing science in a safe way. Sweden joining NATO will only help that cause, and Sweden, in any case, already collaborates very strongly with NATO countries. So some very important messages there. Thank you very much for that perspective, Katarina. Rasmus, I'll come to you once again. I would like you to take us to Svalbard, the island archipelago that is to the north of Norway, which has become the hub for scientific research up in the Arctic. Svalbard has a very special governance model. North Korea, for instance, just recently in 2016 signed the Svalbard Treaty and would now have, in theory, the right to conduct scientific research there too. Now, are scientific research stations in Svalbard truly scientific, or are they embassies? Your view.
Yes, thank you very much, Tor. Can you hear me?
Very well.
Okay, good. Yeah. So first of all, so I'm a political scientist, and I cannot judge the natural sciences research going on there. But just following up on what Katarina Gorfeld was talking about with platforms, etc. I mean, I do understand that Svalbard is probably a very convenient place to do research very far north. It is very far north. There's a long airstrip and airport at Longyearbyen. You can fly from Oslo, Tromsø, etc. There's fiber optic cable from the Norwegian mainland to Longyearbyen. So you can transfer a lot of data quite quickly and reasonably. So there it looks like a very convenient place to do research very far north. If you compare to northeast Greenland across the Fram Strait, I guess it must be the Fram Strait in northeast Greenland, then of course northeast Greenland is extremely inaccessible compared to Svalbard. So you mentioned the Svalbard Treaty from 1920. I think the Svalbard Treaty must be one of the few parts of the Versailles Treaty complex which is still in service, where Norway got sovereignty over Svalbard, while other signatory powers to that treaty, they have non-discriminatory economic rights there. And of course, Norway is very, very jealous of its sovereignty over Svalbard, defined by the treaty. And one of the things that takes place, I mean, 100 years ago, the big thing in Svalbard was coal mining. And Norway and I think Russia has been keeping on coal mining and subsidizing that to have presence. Of course, the other big presence in Svalbard besides Norway is Russia. And there may be a new future in coal mining, you never know. But until half a year ago, there was very little future in coal mining. So what was the new future? And it was science, tourism, space, etc. But in Ny-Ålesund, you have a number of foreign research stations from European countries, Asian countries. And as I say, as a political scientist, I cannot judge the natural science going on there. But when I see presentations from India, China, etc., well, when these countries talk about their Arctic credentials, it's usually when they joined the Svalbard Treaty. And of course, China was the Republic of China was one of the early signatories in the 20s, if not 1920. India signed as part of the British Empire. So these countries they are among the original or very early signatories. and they always refer to their stations there as Arctic credentials. So I think that's pretty obvious. And as I say, Norway, as a Nordic small state, is guarding its sovereignty over Svalbard very, very jealously. Thank you.
Thank you, Rasmus. It was a delicate question and a very carefully crafted answer. Svalbard is obviously a space to watch up in the Arctic, how science develops there, but how other things may develop too. It's very much a place where countries are trying to gain a foothold for building their Arctic credentials, as Rasmus has said, but also for planting a flag. So I think it's something to look at very closely and to watch very closely as we go forward. Yidong, I'd like to come to you with the last question of the second round, and then we will come to our audience. In light of this complex global geopolitical situation and the climate crisis, how is Antarctic governance and the science model that it contains, how is it likely to evolve in your view?
Well, the Antarctic Treaty has more than 60 years of history. And those 60 years, there were a few challenges on the Antarctic Treaty system. First, 1959, the agreement was signed, and then it agreed on the territorial claim of 7 countries. In 1980, there was the issue of fishing in Southern Ocean. So, Convention of Conservation of Antarctic Living Resources, that's the fishing stuff, was created to take care of that issue. And 1990, early 90, the issue comes from the mineral resources and environmental protection. So environmental protocol was added as a part of Antarctic Treaty. That can solve the issue of those very difficult stuff. And now this is 30 years after the protocol was signed. The new challenges now comes. The definitely comes from climate change, not from geopolitical issues. Not like Arctic. Antarctic is almost no geopolitical any confrontation. But what we concern is probably a geopolitical issue from outside of Antarctic, probably spill over to Arctic. That's a very big concern for the group of the Antarctic countries. So climate issue is a very serious one for the Antarctic. I told you Antarctic is very vulnerable, and especially in cryosphere. If the climate warming and if the melting of glacier can rapidly rise up the sea level, it will have a huge impact for human society. So not only the melting issues, but there is a issue of tourism, because it's getting warm. More people can access to the Antarctic easily. And there is expectation that on this coming season, that means 22-23 Antarctic season, that more than 100,000 people probably will visit the Antarctic for just tour. And bioprospecting is another kind of issue will come. And biodiversity in the marine species, because the warming also can cause all this. And also problem comes from the invasion of non-native species for the Antarctic area. So and marine pollution is also another problem. So these all challenges come from directly or indirectly related with the climate change. But I think, as history said in Antarctic community, I think we can can solve this problem very wisely, since in Antarctic there is a mechanism to talk and speak and agree on each issue comes out. Not like Arctic. Arctic is not enough that kind of mechanism. So I am very optimistic to solve any dispute or any disagreement within the Antarctic community. One example I said is 1982. There was a war between UK and Argentina. It's called Falkland Island or Isla de Malvina. There's a war, but during the wartime, they come to the Antarctic Treaty meeting and scientific committee meeting. They speak together, without saying anything on the war. So it have a very good history and a good mechanism of discussion and negotiation. So I think very optimistic for Antarctic Treaty. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So indeed, one of the biggest threats, if not the biggest threats, is climate change, with all that entails in terms of greater accessibility, tourism, exploitation, and a lot of other things. So we will have to see how that as well unfolds. I'd like to now open the floor to our audience. Just very briefly say who you are and who your question is directed to. Please go ahead, sir.
Okay, is it open? Okay, so I will bring you the mic, don't worry. And just a general request to everyone, please keep your questions as short as possible so that everyone can have the chance to ask them.
Hello, thank you for this extraordinary presentation. My name is Frank Tressler. I am the ambassador of Chile, who has some interest in Antarctic. I'm more pragmatic, I think, more than idealistic of the Antarctic system was more pragmatic because we couldn't agree on demarcation or how to exploit. So we decided to freeze the claims for several years. But it's a personal opinion. But my question goes to, I think the challenges of Antarctica and maybe also Arctic is not rather challenges related with those regions. Our challenges are global. For example, overpopulation, scarcity of minerals, scarcity of food. So do you think that in the Antarctic system, is there a possibility to regulate the exploitation of minerals, for example, like creating a system similar to the law of the sea, the seabed mining, system they have? Do you foresee something like that in the future, or do you think the system will stay like frozen forever?
I'll take two more questions, and then we can have some answers, and then we'll go back for a second.
Okay, so all the questions in one go.
3 questions.
Oh yeah, but yeah.
Please go ahead.
Okay, first, the light one to start with. About Monaco, actually, Albert II is very proud to say of his ancestry and that he's very active and very concerned. So I'm so happy that Switzerland is very active. So what can you tell about Monaco? And maybe a serious one. Russia is still, at least on this side, active member of the Arctic Council. You said that there is a big risk. I believe it's difficult to cooperate also because some of their scientists are being persecuted, right? And so maybe, are you afraid that because what they're doing in Ukraine and elsewhere, they can put arms, maybe nuclear arms there? And also, what's about China? It's being quite aggressive now in expanding its presence everywhere. So are you also maybe concerned by eventually their misuse of the Arctic? Thank you.
Thank you. There's a question here.
Hi, I'm from South Africa, and of course we understand that Antarctica is a global common. However, a trend that we're seeing is that non-state actors aren't respecting international law. So my question is, how do we support countries of the Global South, such as South Africa, in order to protect such areas, but also how do we urge non-state actors not to violate sovereignty of transboundary regions such as Antarctica?
Thank you. Yidong, I'd like you to tackle the first question from the ambassador of Chile on regulating the exploitation of minerals.
Yeah, that's a very good question. And just specific to the mineral exploitation, the current protocol say just very simple, one sentence. Any activities related with the mineral resources shall be prohibited. That's it, just one simple sentence. But they never say anything on the succession of how long it will end. But at the annex at the very end said that protocol can be reviewed in 2048. No, if any country can object, have a right to review, that mineral resource can make issue. But even so, the protocol say even that case, some sort of regulatory measure should be made before that mineral excavation start. So there's many measure in between there, and like fishing too. There is some dispute on the marine protected area. There is some discussion on that, but not everybody agreed. But it's still going on anyway to regulate and monitor, conserve the system. So not only the mineral, but all kind of resources exploitation in Antarctic, from my view, is pretty well controlled and monitored by international agreement and institute like Antarctic Treaty and CAMLA and so on. Is that enough for you? Okay.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Larry, do you want to take the question on Russian scientists and China?
Sure. Actually, so SCAR, the Scientific Committee for Antarctic Research, and IASC, the International Arctic Science Committee, we're both involved in a meeting in Monaco in February of this year where Prince Albert III did provide and offer substantial support for young researchers coming into polar science. And both SCAR and IASC were very excited and pleased to see that support, because what it does is it is so difficult for young researchers to cross that boundary from just coming out of an academic program to their professional lives. And so to help these young researchers facilitate that transition is a very good thing from the polar science perspective. So we're very pleased to see Prince Albert's support and the Prince Albert III's Foundation support for polar science. And that's a great thing. With respect to the Russian suppression of dissent and dissented opinions within Russia, that is very, very real. Disinformation is being very effective in Russia, and it is a sad situation to see that, particularly among the Russian scientific community who have spoken out, to see that repression in that community and the consequences of speaking their opinions. So that's a sad state of this situation. I'm afraid of what we can do at this point. Although I guess what I'm not doing, I do have many good friends in Russia, and unfortunately, communication, travel, participation in the Russian community is very difficult right now, and so we're not encouraging them to put themselves in any kind of dangerous situations. With respect to China, I think, at least I have not seen aggression on the part of the Chinese with respect to weapons or actions. I think the Chinese are being very, very active in polar science, and I'm sure they have their own justifications for why they are doing this. And so I don't have the fears with respect to China that I do with respect to Russia. But at the same time, who was expecting this invasion into Ukraine? But I do think there's some wonderful, wonderful researchers both in China and Russia, and I'm pleased with my collaborations I've had in the past, and I look forward to those partnerships in the future.
Alexandra and Katerina, I'd like to put to you the question on the Global South, and then Rasmus, I'll give you the floor in the end to comment on any of the questions that have been posed. Global South and the importance of its inclusion in the polls.
Yeah, I think it's very important to take the bordering countries' issues into what we are working for. But how that is done, I think through scientific cooperation. I mean, I am not familiar with South Africa's case, but I would we had the discussion amongst us with the Swiss Polar Institute, and the researchers said the future of polar research, being in the south or in the north, is international cooperation. And the more that South African scientists can bring themselves into the discussion, I think the better for the understanding of the north, what the neighboring countries, what the wish is. Whether the wishes are going to be fulfilled or not, that's a different story. But at least bring yourself into the discussion and to be at the table and not on the menu.
That's very well put.
Okay, thank you. Well, I cannot elaborate as elegantly as you did, Alexandra, but I can put on some examples of collaboration between Sweden and South Africa when it comes to Antarctica. And the Swedish research station Vasa is on the Dronning Maudland, and we go from Cape Town and collaborate with the South African institutes there. And we also go on our way to the research station Vasa. We stay at your South African station Sanoa there, and there are discussions and opportunities to continue with the scientific dialogues because we meet and so on. So just by thinking about this opportunity that we meet Swedish and South African scientists together at Sanoa, at your station, would be a great opportunity to take to the next level, I would say. But I cannot stop myself from also commenting on the before question here about collaboration between Swedish scientists, for example, and Russian scientists. And I think that the northern countries have very similar policy on that, and that is that it's okay for science-to-science dialogue, but not between scientific institutions. And I will put the attention to the elegant book that we had here during registration, and especially to Rasmus chapter where you elaborate on this and also give an example of that social science. There we can have a dialogue, but for natural science it will become more complicated because that kind of science dialogue includes data, and data goes through institutions, from us to universities and so on. So that's more complicated. But I will not put my word into Rasmus, but that is the bridge over to, I think, read this chapter. It's a very good reading, Rasmus. Yeah.
Thank you. Rasmus, let me give you the floor in case you want to comment on any of the questions that have come up.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I expect I trust you can hear me again.
Yes.
So very briefly, there was a question about nuclear weapons in the Arctic. And of course, the Arctic is chock full of nuclear weapons. The Arctic during the Cold War was absolutely key to mutual nuclear deterrence between the United States and the Soviet Union. And it's because it's the shortest flight path for missiles and aircraft. And it remains very key to that. I usually live in Tromsø in northern Norway, about 500 kilometers from Murmansk. I've visited the Kola Peninsula a number of times, and it's an excessively militarized area because it's home to the Russian Northern Fleet, which is absolutely vital to the Russian nuclear deterrence. And we do have US Virginia-class nuclear-powered fast attack submarines docking close to Tromsø. And of course, these submarines are challenging the Russian nuclear deterrent. And we have US strategic bombers flying over the Barents Sea. So it is an area, and it has been throughout the Cold War, which is absolute. There's probably no part of the world which is more key to nuclear strategic stability between the United States and Russia than the Arctic, and in the future, also including China. About the question about Chinese involvement in the Arctic, I think we have to, China is today one of the world's 2 largest economies, and it still has the world's largest population, will at some point be overtaken by India. And I guess we in the West, we have to get used to that when somebody is one of the world's 2 largest economies, they are likely to have engagements and interests everywhere in the world. In the West, we don't bat an eye that the West is present everywhere in the world. The United States is present everywhere in the world. And I think we'll have to get used to that the rest, as opposed to the West, is also going to be very present, for example, in the Arctic. Finally, thank you to Larry. I appreciate very much Larry's remarks, and I myself, I have had the opportunity for much academic collaboration, both in China and in Russia. And in such circumstances, the safety of our Russian and Chinese students and colleagues, that must be our very, very important priority for us. Katarina, thank you very much for the reference to this book chapter by me. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's see if we can take 2 other very quick questions. Please be very brief. Yes, sir.
I'll bring the mic
to you.
Thank you. I'll be very brief. Stéphane Bussard, Le Temps newspaper. Just a question. What would be the impact of the opening of the Northwest Passage on Arctic, on science, on the geopolitical situation? Thank you.
Thank you. And a question here, the first question from a female member of the audience, all the way at the end here. Thank you.
Hi, Lisa Mattias from CFAR in Canada. I understand that scientists are well-meaning in terms of engaging Indigenous populations in science and the way science is done in the Arctic, but it's not necessarily done in a systematic way, and so Indigenous populations are sometimes consulted, sometimes not necessarily throughout the research process. Is there something that the Arctic Research Council or other organizations are doing to be able to partner with Indigenous communities more actively?
Thank you. On Indigenous people, would you like to answer that? Okay.
Yeah. Okay, and also the Northwest.
Excellent. Please go ahead.
Can I start with the Northwest?
Whichever you want.
Yeah, okay. I'm not a marine captain at all myself. I've just been taking part of several research expeditions in the Arctic and in Antarctica. But as far as I know, I think Larry knows more. The Northwest Passage is quite shallow and hard to navigate in, and tricky for many reasons. But the Northeast Passage, on the other hand, it's dominated by Russian waters, and that is complicated from another point of view. So that is maybe Larry could. But we have done quite many expeditions in the Northwest Passage as well. But I know from discussions from the captains that it's tricky water, it's shallow, and yeah, it happens that ships grounds there, I know.
And actually, the Northwest Passage, it's anticipated, projected that ice will be retained among the high Arctic islands for the longest period. And so there have been passages through. In fact, the Healy came through the Northwest Passage just about a year ago. And so it is passable by icebreakers, but it's not open by any means, and probably won't be for a long time, except for tourist activities and things like that. So I don't anticipate it's going to be a major commercial passage in the near future. With respect to the question about Indigenous engagement, so my day job is I'm the Executive Director of the Interagency Arctic Research Policy Committee, so in the United States. And so my job was to facilitate the development of the U.S. Arctic Research Plan. And one of the foundational activities of that new plan, which will be guiding our U.S. research for the next 5 years, is participatory research, that is engagement of communities, and Indigenous leadership in research. And so that is a foundational activity which all of our federal agencies must integrate and incorporate and implement over the next 5 years. And so that's a very important activity which we are taking very, very seriously. And so I think it is something we've tried to pursue in the recent past. I think Canada is a great example for us to emulate, but it's something that we are going to put as a much higher priority into the near future.
Yes, also in Sweden we have ambitions to increase the dialogue with the indigenous peoples in our region. And when it comes to terrestrial research, we have such dialogue on our research station Abisko, a natural research station in Lapland. Discussions are ongoing there with the reindeerers and their observations about ice and snow and how the nature has changed, how their possibilities to breed and feed reindeers has been changing and so on. And this is valuable for both scientists and indigenous people. And we also, on our research expeditions with our icebreaker Odin, we have indigenous peoples on board for mammal observations and so on. But I know this sounds so small. I mean, we need to increase that. This is just an embarrassing small example. So I'm sorry for that. We really need to take advantage of both sides must really help each other to understand what is going on in climate change and so on. So we will still try to become better with that task. Thank you.
Can I add something to that? I think this is, you say it's a small task, but I think it's a big task, but a small contribution you mentioned. I know from Swiss scientists that they've been reaching out very, very actively to the indigenous communities that they're working on. And as everywhere in life, some are very interested and they participate also in the programs and others are not. But so there need to be that step, the researchers need to do that step, that active step and just reach out and also maybe ask themselves about the reasons why the indigenous don't engage, if they don't engage. So I think there I see an opportunity to increase engagement.
Thank you for that. We have only 1 minute left. Let me just very quickly see if Rasmus, Yidong want to comment on those last questions that have come up. Do you want to offer any thoughts?
I like to add very quick answer for the question on the man up there. I know that in 1990 in the UN there was a lot of argument on the common heritage of humankind concept on the Antarctic. I'm totally agree on that, but intergovernmental organization like Antarctic Treaty, they are very open. If any country can submit anything, they can easily you can be part of it. But that's not enough because many countries they never have any experience in Antarctic or Arctic. It's very difficult for them to study it. So kind of scientific committee like civilian scientific science community like SCAR, we are seeking for diversity of member of an Antarctic community. So one thing we are trying to do is we're trying to educate people. We're trying to make them start their own program easily. That way they bring up their strengths and they start the program. They can join the Antarctic community. That's the way we are now approaching.
Thank you, Rasmus. It's already 6 p.m. here, Geneva time. Over to you for a very, very brief comment.
Yeah, it's a question about indigenous engagement, and I just want to emphasize the importance of strong human capital in both local and indigenous communities in the Arctic. And there, I mean, strong institutions in the Arctic are very important. So in northern Norway, there's the Sami College in Kautokeino. Of course, my own institution, the Arctic University of Norway, mainly in Tromsø, but with campuses throughout northern Norway. We have a Center for Sami Studies, and we have many, many Sami students and Sami colleagues. So I think something very important. It's strong institutions in the north. But final point, then it's also very important that those institutions are not, how to say, self-contained, but there's a very strong brain circulation that people study there, they study other places, they work there, they work other places, and they go back and forth. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this. I think this has been an incredible panel. I know that I've learned a lot from all of you, a very distinguished set of speakers. Thank you, Rasmus, on our screens. And, I think your presence was enormously felt here, even if you were at a distance. And thank you to this very active audience. I will not attempt to wrap up because this topic is by definition still open. So I would just say, watch this space. Science in the polls is something that we need to keep on our radar screens. It will evolve. Thank you. Thank you very much.